Every day, the world moves on as it always has. Cities wake up, work begins, and life feels familiar. But beneath that sense of normality, something is shifting. The climate is changing, and the systems we rely on, energy, food, water, cities, finance, are under pressure in ways we're only beginning to understand. These changes don't live in reports or projections, they are already shaping people, livelihoods, and communities. We created the Climate Leadership Podcast so these challenges don't remain abstract or distant, but are explored through the people working inside these systems, making real decisions with real consequences, often without clear answers. This is not a space for fear, blame, or perfection. It's a space for honest conversations about what leadership looks like in a changing world. If you're listening, you're already part of that leadership. Let's begin the conversation.
Welcome to another episode of the Climate Leadership Podcast, where we explore the real systems and leadership decisions shaping meaningful climate action. Today's episode focuses on how universities can move beyond climate pledge and become operational climate leaders. Campuses function like small cities, managing energy, water, waste, infrastructure procurement, and long-term planning while educating future leaders. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Richard Johnson, Senior Executive Director of Sustainability at Rice University. With over 2 decades of experience, Richard shares how institutions can turn campuses into living laboratories that embed sustainability into infrastructure, governance, and education. Thank you, Richard, for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so as we start our question and answer session, can you please give us a brief introduction about yourself and your journey in sustainability?
Sure. So I graduated from Rice in 1992 with a degree in civil engineering. And I started my career as a highway engineer. And I knew by roughly lunchtime on my first day on the job that I had made a terrible career choice. And it didn't align with really my values and what I wanted to do with my professional life, with my career. And so I went on a sort of a soul searching journey. And what I discovered was what led me into engineering in the first place was I was really interested in the built environment, but not so much in, say, the design of bridges and highways, but how it interacts with the natural environment and improves lives. And that led me into urban planning. And so I thought I was going to be a transportation planner. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia in urban and environmental planning. And just by crazy coincidence, I found myself in a meeting with the dean of the School of Architecture there, who's a well-known sustainability leader named William McDonough. And that 1 hour conversation about sustainability changed my life. And that was the moment where I said, okay, this is what I want my career to be all about. And after I graduated, I started work as a sustainability researcher at the business school at University of Virginia and found there were all sorts of companies that were going on this journey. And there was a real distinction between those that were just kind of treating sustainability as kind of a little side project, a little bit of recycling here and there and that kind of thing. And those who were embedding it in the core of their strategy. And those were the ones who were really making some changes. And those were the ones that attracted me. So after that job, I actually worked briefly as an urban planner. I thought, I should actually give that career a chance. But then there was a job posting for a sustainability officer position at Rice, and I thought, I have got to apply for this, and thank God that I did. That was in December of 2004, and I've been at Rice ever since.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. That was a very interesting and incredible journey.
Thank you.
Okay, Richard. So to begin our conversation, when we talk about universities as climate leaders, what does that mean to you in practical and operational terms?
Sure. So universities are leaders in climate research, and we educate and prepare the next generation of leaders. So of course, it makes for universities to strive to be models for actually addressing climate change and other pressing environmental challenges, and we'd be hypocrites otherwise. So, in practical and operational terms, I'll highlight four areas for university climate leadership. The first is that climate needs to be a key consideration in the university's capital planning, especially with respect to the design and funding of infrastructure. So, for example, a number of universities like Rice have district energy systems where the buildings are all connected together and to a university power plant, sometimes several, that also provide heating and cooling from these centralized systems. But they're often powered by fossil fuels, and they tend to be old. And they tend to be not particularly sexy to invest in, right? And so they have maintenance issues. So, I mean, it takes investments across many years, even decades, to modernize those systems and to transition them to renewable sources and to be more efficient. But often those investments have economic paybacks, and they also address that backlog of deferred maintenance, and they improve safety as well. So Stanford was an early leader in that transition. Before them, Ball State University investing heavily in a version of geothermal. But now many universities are on this journey. You know, Princeton, University of Virginia, many others. The second point is that the design and operations and maintenance of buildings really matters. Buildings account for roughly a third of global energy consumption, and so it's really important to focus on that building level energy efficiency, and not just from day one when the building opens, but across its lifetime. And that's hard work. And to also make good choices about the building materials themselves and the embodied carbon that's involved in making those materials, and their longevity. Some buildings are, of course, so efficient that when you add on-site renewables, they can actually be net energy exporters, which is great. A third point is that procurement really matters. Again, not an area that's particularly sexy, but one of the biggest areas of opportunity is with respect to where the electricity comes from that a university purchases and how that electricity is generated. And in some places like Texas, you have a choice in choosing who supplies your energy and your electricity and how it's generated. So there was an early leader in higher ed. There was a partnership actually between American University and George Washington University, where they went in on a project together. It was about a decade ago, and they enabled the development of a 52 megawatt solar array offsite, and they shared an offtake from that solar array. And of course, a number of universities have lots of on-site renewables. Arizona State has something like 90 solar arrays. Of course, it's in the Phoenix area, so the sun is really strong there. We have some on-campus solar as well. We've got more that's coming online this summer. But then sort of the fourth really important point, and this is the key for me that distinguishes universities from, say, corporate campuses, would be how teaching and research intersect with university operations. And universities are ideal settings to serve as test beds to pilot solutions for sustainability challenges. And we call this using the university as a living laboratory. So whether it's student projects or even ideas that come from faculty, we had faculty members who were experts in using a building material known as mass timber in place of concrete and steel for structural elements of buildings. And there was a presentation on campus, and just by coincidence, the head of our housing and dining department went to it. And he called me up afterwards, and he said, Richard, did you know about this, this material? We ought to be doing this. Otherwise, what are we doing? We're hypocrites. And so we said, okay, how are we going to do a mass timber building on campus? And first we wanted to do a high rise, and we ran into a barrier with the city of Houston. And so we said, okay, maybe a mid rise. And we traveled to London, and we saw what was then the world's largest mass timber project that was in Greater London. and we visited with an architect in London named Andy Waugh of Waugh Thistleton,
Mm-hmm.
and even brought him to campus to educate folks on campus about mass timber. And then
Mm-hmm.
we submitted for a grant through the U.S. Forest Service, and we got $100,000 that enabled the planning for a mass timber building, and now we have a mass timber dormitory on campus. All as a result of that idea of using the campus as a test bed for sustainability,
Right.
and an idea that came from was inspired by faculty research, and a key
Mm-hmm.
administrator said, "Hey, let's do it."
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's incredible story. Okay, so like you also mentioned, universities are often described as micro cities.
Yeah.
How does this perspective reshape how institutions should approach their net zero strategy and long-term climate planning?
So it's funny, yeah, that they are like micro cities, albeit ones with very skewed demographics and no elections of consequence. I mean, in some ways, I think it's actually closer to being a bit like the Vatican City, but without the religion.
Yeah.
Um, there's a single property owner, right? And there's benevolent leadership that can have that can issue a broad vision, and then there's a bureaucracy that, while it can be complicated at times, it's there to enact that vision.
Mhm.
And so universities have the capability to plan in a coordinated fashion at so many different scales,
Mhm.
from the minor renovation of a single building all the way up to those significant infrastructure investments that I talked about, all around that common vision. So
Mhm.
if those things are all aligned, then universities can actually move really quickly, faster than cities even,
Mhm.
to drive sustainability deep into decision making, and to make that transition, which is part of the reason why I think it's so important for universities
Mhm.
to be leading the way and to provide those models that can then provide lessons for cities. But
System.
they certainly do operate like micro cities.
Right.
100% true.
Yes. Richard, I was just thinking like, so I was studying at Rice University. I also visited the UH University of Houston campus.
Yeah.
So that's a very big campus in itself as well. So do you guys have a forum or a platform where different universities also collaborate, or is it only specific to each university?
So we have a forum in the state of Texas called the Texas Regional Alliance for Campus Sustainability, where we coordinate with each other all the time, and we share lessons with each other, and we get together once a year for a
Mhm.
summit where we have presentations. We otherwise just talk about what challenges we're facing, and then
Mhm.
there's within that group. So the acronym is TRACS. And within TRACS, we have a monthly call where university leaders will again coordinate with each other and
Mhm.
identify different challenges. So, for example, um, we had some great successes with composting, and I was able
Right.
to share some of those insights at one of our summits, and
Mhm.
it led to that vendor, which had actually started up in Houston through a rice startup ecosystem. It
Mhm.
led them to becoming the composting vendor for and now something like 10 other universities in the state of Texas. So sort of all across the Texas Triangle.
Mhm.
And so but we're actually having conversations about how can we further scale,
Mhm.
the impact of that group, and sort of accelerate each other, right?
Right, right. So you have helped advance the living lab model at Rice. What does it
Mhm.
mean to use campus infrastructure as a hands-on sustainability classroom?
Yeah. So in my experience, students love working on practical, hands-on projects that solve real sustainability challenges for a client, and especially when the client is their university. And we've been doing this at Rice for roughly 30 years now. So one of my favorite projects was in, gosh, I think it was 2009, and the head of our dining team came to me and said, so back then we had a system in the dining halls where it was all you can eat, and students would have, they had trays, and they could load up their trays with whatever they wanted, and they of course ate with their eyes, and so there would be just mountains of food. And the dining director said, I suspect if we took the trays away and had students carry their plates, that we would reduce food waste. He said, can you think of how we would test that? And
Mhm.
so I was co-teaching a class about using the campus as a living lab, and so we set up a test and a control, or a test and a control experiment.
Mhm.
Some days in a particular dining hall we had trays, other days we'd remove them, and what we found was that food waste went down by roughly a third on days when the trays were gone, and there were side benefits too. Less energy and water and cleaning chemicals required for the dishwashing.
Yes.
Um, but the real light bulb moment for the dining director, and he hadn't even thought about this previously, was like, oh, if there's less food being thrown away, then we don't need to cook as much food, which means we don't need to buy as much food.
Mhm.
And so, there's real savings there. And so he wanted to implement the student's recommendation of trayless dining, and so he went to um, the student governance at Rice. We have a residential college system, so so he went to the leaders of the residential colleges and said, "Hey, we want to enact trayless dining. It will reduce food waste."
Mhm.
And they said, "Ah, you're going to save money through this, aren't you?" And he said, "Well, yes." And they said, "Tell you what, if you roll those savings into better quality food, we will be supportive." And he said, "Absolutely, we can do that." And so that's how trayless dining got started.
Mhm.
But we have dozens of projects like that. We had one a few years ago. Gosh, I think it was almost a decade ago now, um, where some faculty members came to us. They were starting up a class on big data,
Mhm.
and they asked, do you have any big data sets? And we said, well, we have access to all kinds of utility data.
Mhm.
And they said, great, we'll have it. And so, well, okay, wait, what specifically do you want? And they said, well, we don't know. What kinds of problems do you have? And I said, well, if you're operating utility plant, it's hard to know exactly what pieces of equipment to turn on when, because they all have different operating characteristics, and there are all kinds of variables, not just on how equipments operate, but on real-time price of electricity and natural
Mhm.
gas and weather conditions, and just knowing the conditions of how the university is operating. And they said, great, we'll develop an optimization scheme for producing what's called chilled water, which provides the cooling to campus.
Mhm.
And these were students who they had no background in how utility plants operate. So we embedded the plant director and a member of the energy team in the class. And by the end, the students had two different options for a plant optimization scheme. And the plant director said, "You know what? I'm going to implement one of these." And
Mhm.
he did, and it saved $15,000 a month in utility costs.
Mhm.
And those are the kinds of experiences that give students powerful stories when they are applying for jobs.
Mhm.
It's like they've had internships within their courses,
Yes.
and plus it helps us solve problems that we're facing in university operations. So I love the living lab models.
Right.
We've really been accelerating it recently.
Yes. I mean, they're solving real problem and it's real benefit for the university, right? So
It's exactly right.
it's a living internship for them, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so utilities, procurement, and demand response are often overlooked in climate discussions.
Mm.
How do these infrastructure and purchasing decisions materially influence emissions outcome?
Yeah. So just a bit of jargon for those who don't uh, may not have it off the top of their heads. Scope two emissions are for the purchased electricity, and for a number of universities
Mhm.
like Rice, this is the largest category of
Okay.
climate emissions. So so making decisions about where your electricity comes from is really important, and And you can nudge that in a few ways. First, you can focus on reducing the overall consumption through energy efficiency, which is fantastic. You
Mhm.
can also add on-site renewables to generate electricity. And then in some locations, such as here in Texas, you can actually choose to buy electricity from a renewable generating asset. You can develop your own offsite.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of options, and as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of universities that have gone really deep in either the electricity procurement or developing offsite or on-site renewables. But so demand response. We've participated in demand response programs since 2012, and that's essentially we act as a virtual power plant um, when the supply of electricity is getting a little tight on the grid.
Mhm.
And we get paid for doing that. And we've earned roughly $3.2 million in revenues since that time in participating in demand response. And the biggest emissions benefit to that is that we keep those oftentimes less efficient peaker plants offline, and those are usually powered by fossil fuels. And so by our curtailing our load by several megawatts, we keep those from having to be turned on to provide supply, and we help the grid through conditions when electricity supplies are tight. So it's a good complementary strategy to utility scale batteries, which are now becoming really prevalent here in Texas, but it reduces the load from behind the meter customers, and it and we tend to be able to do demand response for longer durations than what a grid scale battery can handle. So it's a really important strategy in influencing emissions outcomes.
Okay. So, Richard, two things. First of all, so scope 2 emission is largest for universities like
For,
Rice,
for rice, yes.
more than scope 3.
Well, so I mean, as your listeners probably know, scope three is really challenging to measure. Um, but so we have measured our estimated our emissions related to air travel and to commuting and all
Mhm.
of those things, and our purchased electricity is well beyond those.
Okay.
Um, uh, so so folks should also understand Houston is in a very hot and humid climate,
Mhm.
and so um, it is very energy intensive to dehumidify the
Mhm.
outside air that we provide for our air conditioning. And
Okay.
so even when you compare our electricity usage versus, say, other universities that are in hot climates but dry climates, we would use considerably more because of that humidity.
Okay, I understand. And also, you said that I got a feeling that Rice operates as a power generation, sometimes generates electricity for the grid.
Well, so what we do is we reduce our consumption, and we sometimes we'll do some fuel switching, but we'll also um, uh, we'll we'll put buildings into rotating air conditioning brownouts.
Mhm.
We'll change ventilation. We'll let the temperatures in the chilled water loops that provide cooling to campus rise a little bit.
Mhm.
We'll send out notices to our community, and we'll ask people to voluntarily, unplug things that don't need to be on, turn off light switches and whatever else that they
Right.
can do. And so we pledge in these programs that we can curtail at least 3 megawatts when we're called upon. So it's almost like we're an Army reserve, and
Mhm.
every now and then we're called upon to go into battle to preserve grid operations, and they'll reach out and test us as well.
Mhm.
So usually we'll pledge a 3 megawatt reduction. We're also looking at how do we, over time, add energy storage onto campus so
Mhm.
that we can expand our participation in demand response. So we're looking at, in particular, chilled water storage for cooling, as well as some thermal storage for heating as well.
Right. So,
Potentially electric batteries too.
okay. So, Richard, I remember in 2025 January, there was snowstorm which hit Houston. So there was a lot of
Hmm.
snow,
Yeah.
and there was a risk of power outrage, right? So, did you also come into picture in some space in that duration?
Absolutely. So we've had a few events like that over the last 5 or 6 years. Winter Storm Uri was another one that you might recall,
Mhm.
um, where the sustainability team was in constant contact with our utility plant operators because our team oversees utility procurement for campus. And so we really care about what's happening with the real-time price of electricity and when it's starting to blow out,
Mhm.
to get really volatile. Um, we work with plant leadership to change plant operations to reduce our consumption and to protect ourselves
Mhm.
from those real-time price spikes. Texas electricity, um, it used to it used to be probably the most volatile commodity in the world. It could go from being so cheap that you would be paid to consume it on up to $9,000 a megawatt hour. Um, Whereas ordinary prices might be, 30, 40, $50 a megawatt hour. So that's a huge, imagine if you were going to the grocery store and at some times of the day, a gallon of milk was $4 or $5, and another times it was, a few $100s, right? It's
Yeah.
that level of volatility, and it would really change your decision making on what you would have for
Mhm.
breakfast.
Yes.
So, similarly, when we see those price spikes, it changes our decision making in what we do with respect to how we use energy on campus.
Okay.
And so, in those moments, um, is really important to have tight coordination with operations
Mhm.
to make decisions that protect the university economically and also reduce our consumption as much as we can to help bring relief to the grid. We
Right.
don't actually export energy to the grid, we
Mhm.
reduce our consumption
Understood. Yes.
significantly.
Okay. Understood. Okay. So next one is in climate vulnerable regions like Houston,
Mm.
water risk is becoming more urgent. How should universities think about water resilience and efficiency?
Yeah. So just to provide a bit of context, Houston has about 50 inches of rain per year. It's about twice that of London. And but the rain tends to happen in a series of big storms that are separated by periods of drought. So we're in the strange position
Mhm.
of worrying about both flooding and drought in Houston. And for our campus, we can toggle our water supply between water that we purchased from the city of Houston, and we also have an on-campus well. And over the years, we've made various connections in our pipe network so that if we lose domestic water service from the city of Houston, we can supply our dormitories and some of our key buildings from that water well. So we have this backup water resilience strategy, which is really
Mhm.
important. We can't rely solely on the well. Um, it's not connected to all the buildings, and then we can't rely on it all year long because then you would have groundwater subsidence, and there are regulations that would
Mhm.
restrict that level of groundwater pumping because portions of Houston have subsided by upwards of 10 feet over the last century because of groundwater pumping, and so now it's
Right.
strictly regulated.
Mhm.
Um, so we've been paying a lot of attention though to reducing our water consumption. It started in 2019.
Mhm.
Um, Quick story, we have this outdoor fountain, and I used to walk by the fountain every day, and the ground material around there was decomposed granite, and it would always be wet. And I thought, surely there's got to be a leak somewhere in this fountain, because otherwise, how is that material getting wet? And so I put in a work order for our through our facilities department. The plumbers came out and they said, "Oh no, the fountain's fine. It's just um, rainwater that hasn't dried up. And I was like, well, it hasn't rained in a long time. So I reached out to the plant director, and we got some dye, and we dumped a bunch of green dye into the fountain. And the next day when I came to work, all of that decomposed granite was green. And so we knew, aha, we found there's a leak. We proved it. And so we had this sort of aha moment. Well, gosh, why don't we put a water meter on the fountain? That way we'll know when there's a leak. And and we said, well, if we're doing it for that fountain, why don't we start doing it in other places? Well, 167 meters later, we now have a very robust water leak detection program.
Okay.
And we've reduced our water consumption from 2019 by about 15 or 16%, which, let me put this into perspective. It's about as much water to fill 67 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It's enough water to supply all the retail customers of the city of Houston for over 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
44 million gallons water saved annually now.
Wow.
And these are projects that have a really fast payback.
Mm-hmm.
Usually 3 years or less, some in a matter of weeks.
Right.
I have someone who watches a water dashboard
Okay.
every day, and we see when leaks happen, we resolve them quickly.
Mm-hmm.
We also now have cisterns on campus to collect rainwater and use it for irrigation.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that's pretty novel is, Houston, again, it's a hot, humid climate. And when you make air conditioning, you strip the humidity out of the air before you
Mm-hmm.
pump it into the building. Well, usually that water goes to a drain. Well, we're
Mm-hmm.
capturing it in a lot of instances, and we're
Right.
bringing it back to cooling towers to use in cooling towers. And so we're doing roughly 12 to 14 million gallons of HVAC condensate recovery now, which is a
Mm-hmm.
huge deal. It's like 5% of our total water consumption.
Right. Right. Yes. I remember like air conditioners in India in my house, there's a water dripping from it because of the moisture, right?
That's
So you were,
exactly right.
yeah,
So
so you,
imagine that at the scale of a lab intensive research building, especially if it's a tower.
Mhm.
There's a constant flow of water,
Mhm.
and so why not reuse that water?
Absolutely. Okay, Richard. So finally, looking ahead into the future, how do you see universities shaping global leadership, climate leadership over the next decade?
Huge question. So, I think one of the key areas is actually the evolution of this living lab concept.
Okay.
Um, and it goes beyond just doing these onesie twosie projects within the university. It's
Okay.
about putting together uh, a university-wide governance,
Mhm.
building the infrastructure to have projects that reach out into the community, and they develop partnerships with local governments and nonprofits and with industry,
Okay.
so that the university becomes a climate accelerator, or I should say, an accelerator of climate tech and sustainability solutions.
Mhm.
And it's also a key way that universities can continue to demonstrate their relevance to communities, especially when they focus on solving real community challenges and working in a positive manner with local stakeholders.
Mhm.
So it's the opportunity to move from campus impact to system-wide influence. So,
Wow.
universities will lead by, demonstrating those scalable real-world solutions and serving as bridges between research and deployment, and of
Mhm.
course, training the workforce that's needed for this transition, not just of energy, but of infrastructure and basically everything. And then and creating those partnerships with cities and with industries to accelerate the adoption. Because if universities aren't doing this, then frankly, what are we doing?
Yes, I think universities have this very beautiful system where they can test those solutions. And once it's a hit, like a like it's a successful solution, then it can be adopted worldwide or countrywide, right?
That's exactly right. And universities increasingly have these mechanisms where we can help technology go from the lab to
Yes.
real world scalability.
Mhm. Right. So, Richard, thank you for today's conversation and for sharing such a systems level perspective. on climate leadership in higher education. Today's conversation reminds us that universities are uniquely positioned to lead because they operate at the intersection of infrastructure, governance, research, and education. When campuses become living laboratories, sustainability moves beyond theory and becomes operational, measurable, and embedded in institutional culture. Climate leadership in higher education is not only about reducing emissions, it is about modeling systems transformation society urgently needs. To our listeners, thank you for joining the Climate Leadership Podcast. Until next time, take care and have a nice day. Bye bye.